Hi, this is Tim Weber from South Texas College coming to you with part two of the introduction to lifespan human development. So in this video, we'll have a look at some of the major theories of development that you'll encounter throughout the course, general scientific research methods. We'll also look at research methods for studying development over time that are specific to this type of study, and ethics in studying human development. So in looking at theories, we'll start with one of the first modern theories of human development, psychoanalytic theory. And there are actually numerous psychoanalytic theories. What you should know about them is that all of them focus to some extent on the influence of the unconscious on people's motivation, behavior, personality, and so forth. So when you think psychoanalytic, think the unconscious. We'll start with Freud's psychoanalytic theory. It was one of the first. And once again, Freud then believed that people were motivated by unconscious drives that were just naturally part of the person, and that the person then developed through what he called psychosexual stages of development, that there was a erotic type of energy that was akin to sexual energy that the person was born with, and that energy then sought to be gratified in various areas of the body at various points in time. And so you see each stage an important part of the body. So you have the oral stage here, the gratification centered around the mouth area. This would be babies. And if you've noticed babies, yes, they do like to put things in their mouth. They like to bite things and taste them and that sort of thing. The second stage, the anal stage, these energies would focus on the bowels and bladder, and the gratification of this involved the child holding and expelling their wastes. The phallic stage had to do with, well, to some extent, the genital area, but really more of an erotic attraction to the parent of the other sex. We'll get into that maybe later on in the course. Then there would be from age 6 through puberty, a latent period where those erotic desires would die down. And then as one reached puberty, these desires would be satisfied through normal adult sexual activity. I won't go into all the details of the stages by any means. We just don't have enough time to go over all of them here, but I will give you an example. And before we do that, also in each of these stages, there then would be a conflict that would arise. The conflict would be between those instinctive drives that the person has, those natural drives that they're born with, and then the conflict would involve what is socially acceptable. So, for example, the oral stage. So babies love to put things in their mouth and explore them that way. They like to bite on things, and everything is fine until someone comes along and they say, "Hey, you can't put that in your mouth. That's dirty." Or they tell the child, you can't just go around biting people whenever you feel like it. You've got to control that urge. So now we have a conflict. And so, according to this theory, how the child was able to manage that conflict and adapt to it would influence their later behavior. And if they were unable to make the necessary adaptations, if they had trouble with that, or if they had were kept from receiving normal gratification in that area of the body, they would end up with a fixation. And that would be that they would still be trying to resolve that conflict, or to fight against that conflict even later on. And so the child that could not come to grips with that challenge to restrain their behavior to bite and put things in their mouth as an adult might be someone who has trouble with what, eating too much, drinking too much, maybe biting on their fingernails all day, or maybe making biting comments that hurt other people. That's the idea. Now, how much evidence do we have to support these type of conclusions? Well, sometimes it's sketchy, and sometimes the evidence that has arisen since the time of Freud actually contradicts what Freud believed. But it's actually amazing to see how many things Freud did to get right if you actually read his works. We should also credit for Freud for making us aware of the possibility that unconscious drives, even things that we don't remember, might have some influence on us later. And also the idea that what occurs in early childhood might be crucial to normal development later on. So we have to hand it to him of taking notice of that, even if we disagree about the details. So the second psychoanalytic theory that you'll run into frequently in the course is Erikson's um, psychosocial theory of development. And so Erikson also believed that there were going to be conflicts and challenges throughout, um, in this case, the person's entire lifetime, and that the person in this case, would be striving to meet social needs at each of these crisis points. And so rather than psychosexual stages, with Erikson, you have psychosocial stages. And you can read the list of them here. These do span the entire lifespan. Let me give you some examples. You have trust versus mistrust. Erikson saw babies as grappling with that. Is the world a place where you can trust that you can get what you need, that you can be adequately taken care of, or do you have to mistrust others? Do you have to be pessimistic that you're going to actually get what you need in life? And what regulated how that baby falls when it comes to trust and mistrust? Primarily the caregiver that worked with them. Could that caregiver be trusted to provide food and nurture when needed, or was that caregiver neglectful? And according to Erikson's theory, then if that person ended up with a sense of basic mistrust, this would be something they might have to fight with, potentially, maybe even lifelong. And they might find that they have trouble trusting others, but not knowing why later on. Or let's take another example. How about identity versus role diffusion? That's something that Erikson saw occurring during the teenage years, and the adolescent looks at themselves and tries to decide who they are as a distinct person. What are their particular values? What are their goals that they want to achieve in life? Which way are they going? If the adolescent was unable to come to grips with that, then they would end up in a state of role diffusion. They didn't know where they were going. They're sort of like a ship with no power and just kind of drifting along in life and not ready for the next stage of life in adulthood. And let's take one more example, integrity versus despair. This is one that Erikson saw occurring in old age. And as the elderly person looks back on their life, they try to make sense of it all. And so they try to figure out just what did it all mean? What did I accomplish? How can it make sense? If they can do that, they're able to cope with aging relatively well. On the other hand, if they can't figure that out, it just doesn't seem to make any sense. It seems to be meaningless. They haven't accomplished anything. then they may fall in a state of despair. And that's a sad thing to see indeed. So notice how also what you see in those psychosocial stages, most people will say, that's much more obvious to me than what Freud might be talking about with those psychosexual stages. We'll also note that maybe Erikson, even though he puts these into one particular point in the lifespan, in fact, many of these may crop up at other times as well. Now, we also then will encounter behavioral theory. The behaviorists were ones who believed that psychologists should only study what can be directly measured and directly observed. And in so doing, though, they did identify many ways in which we learn. And so often this is also called learning theory. And their conclusion was that development occurred through a process of constant conditioning rather than through a series of stages. So they did not identify any stages of development. So they also um, came to the conclusion that we learn through associating something that we already were familiar with something um, that occurred along with it or shortly thereafter. And so one type of learning that they identified became known as classical conditioning, where we make an association between events that occur together, one thing that happens and is followed consistently by another thing. And so maybe you've heard of Ivan Pavlov, the Russian physiologist who found that dogs could learn to salivate to tone because every time they heard the tone, they got food placed in their mouth. And so eventually just the tone produced salivation. Or we can point to the work of John Watson, and who in his famous Little Albert experiment showed that even emotional responses could be learned responses. In particular, Watson trained little Albert to fear a white rat that he previously had no fear of. He did so by making a loud noise every time little Albert saw the rat. Eventually, Albert simply had to see the rat to become afraid. So classical conditioning, they then concluded, was responsible for all types of respondent behavior and responding to one event as if it was another, or indicating that the next event was about to occur. They also studied operant conditioning. One of the prime individuals who did much work on this was B.F. Skinner. And so this identified that we also make associations between engaging in some behavior and its consequence, between what we do and what happens as a result of what we do. So this then would focus on how reinforcement, a desirable or pleasant consequence, might urge us to repeat a certain behavior, whereas behavior resulting in punishment meant that we were going to avoid that behavior in the future. So a great deal of experimental research was done by the behaviorists, although I will have to point out that the behaviorists did not actually do that research on humans. It was all animal research. So at least until very recently, these things were not tested amongst humans. Okay, on to then we have also, let me get this out of my way, I'm sorry, social learning theory. So social learning theory goes beyond the behaviorist theory in that it also admits that it's possible that we can learn without direct experience. We can learn by observing others and then modeling our behavior on what they do. Albert Bandura was one of the primary individuals who first studied this, and the famous experiment here was what's called the Bobo doll study. Bandura had this inflatable doll that would stand up every time you knock it over. Maybe you've seen one of those. And then he had a group of children who he divided into two groups. One group of children saw an adult who played nice with the Bobo doll, and the other half of the children saw an adult who played mean with the doll, who hit the doll, and so forth. They then allowed each child individually a chance to play with the doll, and lo and behold, yeah, you probably guessed it, those who watched the nice adult model tended to play nice with the doll. Those who saw the aggressive adult model tend to engage in more aggressive behavior towards the doll, and even invented new ways to be mean to the doll. So they imitated not just the actual actions, but the spirit of the actions as well. So social learning theory then says, hey, we don't have to directly experience something. We can see what others do and learn from it. Next, we get to Piaget's cognitive theory. And so he observed that, cognitive theory, how we process information. Okay, so focuses on how we process information. So our cognitive development then would develop through experiencing cognitive equilibrium as well as cognitive disequilibrium. So cognitive equilibrium, that's when things that are happening in the world are consistent with the way you see the world. And so the kinds of things that you expect are what you actually see happening. The other side of that, cognitive disequilibrium, along comes some new idea or some experience that doesn't square with the way you thought the world works. And so that makes us uncomfortable. And here's a few adjectives that might describe that state of disequilibrium. We are puzzled. We have a sense of chaos, confusion, questioning. There are discrepancies. There's dissonance. You know, yeah, it's just things are not matching up. So what we'll do, because this is uncomfortable, we will make some adaptation. And we might do that in one of two basic ways. So we might do so by engaging in the process of assimilation, or we might use the process of accommodation. So assimilation, what we do is we take that new experience or new idea and we try to fit it into our old ideas. Accommodation, what we're going to do is we're going to take that old idea and we're going to modify it so that it can include that new experience, or we maybe even will come up with a whole new category in order to account for that new experience. So let me give you one example. Let's say we have a little girl and she's had good experiences with dogs. And so her viewpoint of dogs is that dogs are nice. And then one day she meets a dog that bites her just a little bit, but enough to really scare her. And it also shakes her up because now, what are you going to do with that? It doesn't fit with what she thought about dogs. Now, she could use the process of assimilation and try to fit that new experience into her old idea. So maybe she could say to herself, well, you know, it was just an accident, you know, or maybe, well, no, it really didn't hurt. Um, Notice that that might not quite really reflect reality. And that's one of the dangers of using assimilation when we have that new experience. On the other hand, she could use the process of accommodation. And she could say, well, you know what? I guess maybe my old idea about dogs needs some modification. Maybe there's two categories. Maybe there's dogs that are nice, and maybe there's dogs that aren't so nice. And so now we move forward. Now, notice either way, once having successfully done this, we then return to a new sense of equilibrium, and everything seems fine. I think you'd probably agree, though, that for the most part, we make more progress in our thinking and understanding of the world when we use that process of accommodation rather than simply trying to cram new experiences into old ideas. Now, here's another example of how schema are ideas about things, can change according to assimilation or accommodation. So let me bring up my video for you and make sure that also I think we'll still have sound. So here we go. Here's the video.
Schemas are categories or the basic structures we use to organize information. They're almost like folders. In this case, the categories are about vehicles, cars, and trucks. Information is sorted into these schemas or concepts. Each new piece of information has to have somewhere to go, a folder to fit into. When new information can fit into one of the schemas that has already been created, like cars or trucks, it is placed there. This is called assimilation. Sometimes we come across new information that does not fit into any of the already existing schemas. An Escalade isn't a car or a truck. That means a new folder or schema has to be created so this information has a place, like SUVs. This process is called accommodation. The Escalade now has a folder to fit into, a schema it belongs to. Now new information can continue to be sorted into schemas using assimilation. And the process continues.
Okay, there we go. Now let me see if I can get back to our outline. I hope I can do it.
Schemas are categories or the basic structures we use to organize.
Here we go, got that stopped. Okay, and back to our outline. Sorry guys, I'm just not the smoothest on this, but
Organize information. They're almost like folders.
okay, maybe I better pause it. There we go, I finally got it stopped. Okay, and so now let's go on. So continuing to talk about Piaget's stage theory of cognitive development, he also identified stages in which we process information at a new level in some way. So I'll just briefly review these for you. You'll run into these throughout the course as well. The pointer going again here. Okay, so from birth to 2 years roughly, the child is what he called the sensory motor period. So they use their senses and their motor abilities, their developing ability to move around, to gather information about the world. It's active learning. They're not really yet having much in the way of concepts or reflecting on things. One of the biggest developments during this time is self-awareness as well as object permanence. Object permanence being the ability to recognize that things still exist and retain their basic qualities even when you can't see them. That's a pretty big improvement from not recognizing that. From age 2 through 6, then he sees them going through the pre-operational stage. Here you have kind of magical thinking. There's not really logic to it, and the thinking is egocentric. So in other words, they believe that everybody sees the things just the way they do, that everybody thinks the way they do and feels the way they do. And so it's a time of great imagination, language development, the ability to recognize symbols to represent things is the big development here. And so that brings their thinking into a greater ability. Then you have from age 6 through 11, what he calls a concrete operational stage. And the big advance here is the ability to apply logic, at least to things that they can directly experience, see, hear, touch, and so forth. Now, they're not yet ready to reason about abstract things, but you got to admit, logic with material things is a big advance that enables them to learn many of the things they do in school: numbers, classification, scientific ideas, and so forth. We'll get into more detail later. Then starting with age 12 or puberty, then the child would enter the formal operational stage where now they can also think about and reason about abstract things and hypothetical situations. So now they can begin to understand topics like ethics and politics, moral issues, and so forth. So that's Piaget's uh, theory and his stages. Now, a couple additional theories, not as big as theories, but that you'll still run into frequently in this course, would be the social cultural theory of development. This was promoted by Lev Vygotsky, amongst others. Vygotsky was a Russian sociologist. And his idea was that one's cultural context would guide their development. And so we would develop in our thinking and behaviors through the influence of mentors, more experienced members of our culture who would work with us sort of in a hands-on sort of way and would lead us and structure the learning and development as we went along. So according to social cultural theory also, there were no specific stages, rather one continuously went through that development. We also should note that there is another type of cognitive theory, more modern cognitive theory, that again has to do with how we process information. In this case, it is more similar to our ideas about how computers work with information. So this would study then how memory develops, what types of memory exist, how we develop in our reasoning, thinking skills, various biases and errors that we might make in thinking and so forth, and how thoughts and values then are going to influence our development. We also have the influence of humanist theory. So humanist theory was kind of a reaction against behaviorism and psychoanalytic theory. Here's how that happened. Up until about the 1960s or so, you had two basic choices in psychology. You could be a behaviorist, and everything was about measuring and observing behavior, or you could be a fan of a psychoanalytic theory and focus on unconscious influences. The humanist theory kind of reacted against both of those. They looked at psychoanalytic theory and they said, well, we don't like this because psychoanalytic theory, at least Freud's psychoanalytic theory, would say if you had something go wrong in your early childhood, you're going to be scarred for life and you're going to be a victim of your childhood lifelong. They said, we don't like that. We think that humans are resilient and they can overcome early mishaps. Now, they didn't like behaviorism much either because they said, well, behaviorism sort of just turns you into a robot that's being programmed by your environment. And they said, you know, you don't have to be a victim of your environment. You don't have to be what your environment tells you. You can make your own choices. So they look to what is a human's potential and how can we help people achieve their highest and best potential. In doing that, they also identified that people were all similar and that they had a certain set of similar needs no matter who they were. And you can see them on this chart. Physiological needs, needs for safety and security, social needs, needs for esteem, and some needs for self-actualization. Now, I thought it would be fun to give you an example here that applied these needs to children's needs, and I think it's very helpful. So, at the base of this pyramid, the most basic thing, people are going to, first of all, need their physiological needs taken care of. So, for children, that means what? Food, water, sleep, shelter, and human touch. Now you might say, is that physiological? Yes, because human touch brings out very important physiological processes that are necessary in early childhood. Get into that later. But notice, yet what people need first and foremost of anything, and that's what they're going to be after before anything else on this chart. Now, once physiological needs are satisfied, then the person is going to turn to needs for safety and security. And so for children, that might involve adults who protect them from danger, keep an eye on them and, have the baby proof jars and put them in the car seat properly. Uh, a plan that if something happens to their parents, that they'll be taken care of. They need access to health care. They need to be free from abuse or neglect so that they can feel safe and secure. Now, once people are satisfied at that level, then their interest is going to turn towards social needs. What social needs do kids have? Well, they have needs for unconditional love, that they know that their parents or whoever takes care of them loves them no matter what, whether they succeed or fail, whether they agree with what those people say or not, that someone just cares about them no matter what. They also need loving interaction with those who care for them. They need room for exploring and playing and interacting with other kids. And that way, they get a chance to learn how to interact and satisfy that need to interact with others. Now, once a person is satisfied at the level of social needs, then the needs for esteem come to the forefront. So for children, that might be found by receiving encouragement, being protected from bullies and from discrimination, from receiving respect from their parents, teachers, or other kids, uh, experiencing positive discipline and learning life skills all provide a sense of esteem for the child. Now, by the way, you might ask, what's positive discipline have to do with the child's need for esteem? That's always a weird one for people. But think about this, positive discipline helps children learn appropriate ways to behave in certain situations. And so that discipline assures then that other people will enjoy having them around and will want to interact with them. If you don't have that, nobody wants them around. Nobody wants to play with them. It's pretty miserable. So, yeah, good positive discipline really is a very important thing for kids. Then, if one's sense of esteem is sufficient, then one might actually take a crack at self actualization. And self actualization then is striving to reach your greatest potential. You might say, trying to become the best you can at whatever you're best suited for. And so, what may help kids with that would be to provide them and allowing them to develop various hobbies, giving them a chance to, say, learn new language or to engage in various creative pursuits, to try, say, dancing or martial arts or painting or poetry or whatever. Give them a chance to try those things so that they can find out just what are they best suited for and can then develop themselves along those lines. So there you go. This is a very useful um, sort of paradigm that we can look at. as to how people are motivated. Now we shift to having a look at how the scientific method comes into play in studying human development. And so one method that we might apply would be scientific observation. Now, in this type of research, we observe people and their behavior systematically and objectively. So there is a specific thing, action, behavior that we are looking at, and we then record, take note of that behavior as we observe others, either in their usual setting, and then that's called naturalistic observation, or sometimes that may require observation under artificial circumstances, in which case it's called laboratory observation. So, a couple examples: naturalistic observation. How about observing kids on a playground and observing how many times within 30 minutes children engage in aggressive behavior towards one another without the children noticing that anyone is watching them. And by the way, that's an important part of scientific observation. We don't want to have people knowing that they're being observed, because when people know they're being observed, often their behavior changes. Children don't know they're being observed, then we've got naturalistic observation. Now, laboratory observation, an example here would be, let's say we want to know whether the stages of sleep differ between children of various ages and adults. Then we'd have to bring kids into a laboratory, people into a laboratory, and hook them up to all kinds of sensors to detect those stages of sleep, to detect blood pressure, heart rate, eye movements, and brain waves, maybe even, and that sort of thing. Now, we're not doing anything intentionally to change the sleeping behavior. We want it to be just as natural as possible, but we have to put them in a somewhat artificial situation. So, two types of observation, both scientific. We also may use case studies. We can study an individual in great depth, maybe, for example, to study someone who's gone through a very unusual experience, and this may give us some idea about what the possible responses to that situation might be. Case studies also allow us to go into depth. We might take a personal history of the person's behavior in the past. We might continue to observe their behavior over time. We might use various physical and psychological tests as well. We can learn a great deal about that individual and how they responded to that situation. That said, we also have to recognize that the result of the case study may be unique to that individual. If we were to study other people, we might find differing responses to that. Nonetheless, it does give us some idea of the possibilities, and is also useful in illustrating other concepts that we have identified through other types of research. The case study might give us a more personal example of what we've learned through other types of research. We also may use surveys to study various aspects of development. And to do so, we may interview people or have them respond to a questionnaire, set questions. To do so, we're going to identify a sample group from the population that we want to know about. It's important that we engage in random sampling. Random sampling means that every individual within that group has equal chance of being included in our sample group and receiving that survey. Equal chance of receiving it. There's another little wrinkle to that. Not only must we have a random sample, but it must be large enough individuals to give us valid results. Now, getting valid data from surveys is somewhat tricky, okay? It can be done, but it's not always easy. And there's a couple reasons. There's something called the self-serving bias. People tend to report about themselves in a way that puts themselves in a somewhat better light, makes themselves look better. So sometimes people don't quite tell the truth, surveys. Um, Sometimes people's perception of themselves is not entirely accurate as well. Sometimes they really don't know themselves that well, and so they can't really give you an accurate report of their ideas or behaviors or values or whatever we're getting at with the survey. Let me give you one interesting example of this. Uh, they gave a group of boys a survey about sexual activity twice when they were in high school, once when they were in ninth grade, and the same boys again when they're in 12th grade. Oddly enough, a greater percentage of boys reported having sex with someone else in grade 9 than in grade 12. A smaller percentage in grade 12. It's the same boys. And you say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, it may be that there was a certain bias and that boys in ninth grade over-reported sexual activity, maybe in an effort to seem more grown up or something like that. But notice there is a few things we can do to reduce the effects of self-serving bias. We can make the survey as anonymous as possible. If the person feels that no one can identify who is actually making that response, they're more likely to give us accurate results if it is more anonymous. Okay. The wording of questionnaire surveys also is significant. How questions are wording may influence how people reply. For example, if we ask the question, should pornography not be allowed on TV, we'll get a different level of responses than if we ask, should pornography be forbidden on TV? You'll have a lot more no's when the word forbidden is in the question than when you have not allowed. Now, in fact, it means the same thing. Either case, it's not going to be there. But notice that people will respond differently. And even the sequence of questions makes a difference. If we arrange the questions in a certain way, it may lead people towards certain types of responses. So in evaluating surveys, I always tell students, first of all, find out, is there really a random sample of this survey here that we're looking at? Were there enough people in that survey? And just how were the questions worded? And particularly if you look at the results of the survey and you say, gosh, that doesn't seem right to me. Yeah, start looking at those things. Now, let's also look at the correlational method of research. We can take information gathered through any type of descriptive research that we just looked at, and we can compare factors. Okay, so correlation tells us, is one variable more or less likely to occur when the other does? Is one variable more or less likely to go up or down when the other does? Essentially, what it's telling us is there a statistical relationship between these two things? So, if we find that our two factors we're looking at result in a positive correlation, that is a plus number, then we know that both of these things tend to increase together or decrease together, or they tend to occur together rather than apart. If we receive a negative number, that correlation, then that means one variable increases as the other decreases. There's an inverse relationship or opposite relationship between our two factors. factors. If that correlation is 0 or near 0, then that means that there is no statistical association between those two things. So one of the things you should know about correlation, it is useful for prediction. For example, correlational studies, generation-wise, show us that if you have, there is a correlation between various family members and depression. If one family member has depression, there is a higher likelihood that another will as well, at least amongst blood relatives. So that might lead us to predict that if depression has run in the family, that this is something that we should be alert for in the next generation of that family. Um, we should also know correlation does not equal causation. Just because two factors correlate even strongly does not mean that one is causing the change in the other. So let's look at a couple examples that may help to clarify some of that. So here we have an example, two variables, ice cream sales and the murder rate. So would you guess that these have no correlation, near 0, or that you'd find a positive or negative correlation between those two? Yeah, you can stop the thing and think a bit for a minute. What would you think? Do these two things tend to go together, go up and down together, or no relationship? Now, most people look at that and they go, oh, I don't see how these things could have anything to do with one another. But indeed, there is a significant correlation between ice cream sales and the murder rate. When one is up, the other tends to be up as well. Okay, so now you don't believe me, right? Okay, well, they're not causally related. It's not that ice cream sales cause the murder rate to go up. You know, it's not that committing murder causes people to buy more ice cream. That's not why there's a statistical relationship here, but it's rather a third factor that creates this relationship. If you think about it, when do ice cream sales go up? Well, when it's hot out, right? When is the murder rate highest? Also, when it's hottest out. If you look at the murder rate in, say, Houston, it shoots up as the temperatures get up over 90. And so the third factor that causes this positive correlation between these two things actually is temperature. Now, try this other one. Let's call this reading ability rather than learning to read. Reading ability and number of baby teeth. Well, if you guess that that would be a negative correlation, you're right. As a matter of fact, as reading ability goes up, the number of baby teeth that people have goes down as they lose those baby teeth and get their adult teeth, right? So you can see there's one where you have a connection, but it is an opposite sort. Okay, I'll leave number 3 for you to figure out later if you want. Okay. All right. So now what if we want to know if two factors are related in a cause and effect type of relationship? The only way that we can know for sure whether these two things are related in this way would be to conduct an experiment. This is the only type of research that gives us cause and effect. So basically what the experiment shows us, if we adjust one variable while keeping every other variable constant, is adjusting that one variable going to change the results? Is it going to affect a second variable? And so in your experiments, what you'll see is there is an independent variable, also often known as the experimental variable. So this is the variable that the researcher is going to manipulate and adjust or change from one time to another or from one group to another. You then have the second variable called the dependent variable. This is the outcome or result that the researcher measures after the independent variable has been imposed. We also, in many experiments, will have a variety of groups. We will have an experimental group, or maybe more than one. Sometimes that's called the treatment group. So the experimental group is exposed to this independent variable, this thing that the experimenter is going to change from what is normal or usual. Then we're also going to have a comparison group. Often that's called a control group. This is the group that doesn't receive exposure to that independent variable. So how are experiments then conducted? Well, first of all, you have to gather a group of participants. And then, if you're going to use a group-wise type of experiment rather than before and after, then you're going to divide them into two groups. Now, remember, the only thing that can differ in the experiment is the independent variable from one group to another. So how do we get two groups here, comparison and experimental group, that are basically the same no matter what? The same in terms of the ratio of, say, male to female, same in terms of educational ability, same in terms of age, same in terms of income, or any number of other things. Because remember, everything has to be the same, equal in each of these groups, except for the experimental group receiving the independent variable. How do we get two groups that are alike? A lot of people, when I ask this in class, they'll say, well, maybe we have to like interview people about, dozens of things, and then we have to try to match them up. But you know what? We're going to lose our minds trying to do that. Turns out there's a very easy solution to this, almost magical. It's called random assignment. There it is at the bottom. Random assignment, what we do is we just randomly assign them to each group. And if we have enough people, you're going to get two groups that has same ratio of males to females, same in terms of age composition, same in terms of income, same in terms of education, and so forth. You're going to get two groups that are distributes all of those differences equally into those two groups, if you have enough people. Okay, so the experimental group then receives the special treatment, the independent variable. The comparison group does not receive that special treatment. Now, there's a little wrinkle here that's not mentioned here. If this control group receives nothing and this experimental group receives something, there is an inequality. And think about it. Let's say you're testing a medication. If one group gets a medication and the other group gets nothing, you actually do have a difference. You have a difference in expectations. Because when you receive some sort of special treatment, it creates an expectation that a change is going to happen. So how do we then equalize these two groups when it comes to expectations? What we may do is use a placebo, something that appears for all outside appearances to be the same thing as that independent variable, but has no ability to influence, to actually do anything. It is inert. So in the example of testing a medication, experimental group gets the medication. The placebo for the comparison group is some kind of sugar pill that doesn't do anything. Now we have similar expectations. So what we then do when this is all said and done is we come over here and we look at the dependent variable, the outcome, and we have a look to see, is there a significant difference now between these two groups when it comes to that dependent variable? Now, of course, there's maybe all sorts of random variations that come up. You know how one day you're just a little bit better at something than others and so forth. So in order to if we see any differences here, be sure that the differences are actually not just due to chance variation. We will use tests of statistical significance. These tests of statistical significance will tell us whether those differences here are large enough that they didn't just happen by chance, that it's highly unlikely that that is a chance variation. Okay, now just a couple of other wrinkles here. We might conduct an experiment and find that our independent variable does reach statistical significance. It does consistently cause a change in our dependent variable. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's really anything useful. I'll give you an example. Let's say we're testing a blood pressure medication, and we look at the results, and we find that, yes, the blood pressure medicine did produce a statistically significant change in blood pressure. It consistently produced changes in blood pressure in our experimental group. Is it useful? Well, we don't know until we look at the next thing, the effect size. Just how much did it change blood pressure in that group? And maybe let's say we look at it and find, well, it only changed the blood pressure, only brought it down 2 points on average. And I say, well, yeah, it's significant because it was consistent. It did do something, did cause a change, but for practical usage, it's not very useful. It didn't really have a large enough effect size. So that's another thing we have to look at. Now, I should also mention, when we talked about expectations, there's an expectation that we didn't handle at that point. What about the influence of the experimenters, the researchers' desires, or the expectations of the researcher? We have to take that into account because those expectations could potentially throw off the results as well. The researcher might, well, if they're crooked, they might intentionally treat each group differently. But even unintentionally or unconsciously, if they were hoping to see a particular result, they might treat that experimental group somewhat different than their control group. So in order to prevent that, what we do is we conduct double-blind studies. In these studies, neither the research assistants who are providing the treatments or the placebo, nor the participant knows who's getting the actual treatment. So that prevents the research assistants from influencing the outcome either unconsciously or intentionally. So all things being equal, we're going to prefer an experiment where the control group received a placebo, and we're going to prefer a double-blind experiment over a simple placebo experiment as well. So as you see various experiments throughout the textbook, you evaluate those in that way and look to see, did they actually have random assignment? Was there a placebo for the control group? Did they control for the researcher's expectation by using double-blind studies and so forth? Okay. So now let's look at research methods that are specific to studying the lifespan. The first of these is cross-sectional research. So here we gather a group of people of various ages, okay, of diverse ages, and we measure them on some particular variable, and then we split up the data by age group. Okay, so on this here, you'll see we gather a group of people, all different ages, and measure them all at the same time, and see how did each group fare on that particular variable. Now, presumably, when you look at this, differences must be due to age, but we're going to find that not necessarily, because say the 18-year-olds here might have had different experiences in life than the 6-year-olds, so those different experiences might have to do with why we see differences rather than natural developments. So cross-sectional research. The next type is called longitudinal research. Here what we do is we gather a group of individuals, we measure them on some variable, and then we continue to collect data on the same individuals as time goes by. So longitudinal research, I always remember this one. Well, it takes longer to do that. Notice the word long is in the word as opposed to cross-sectional research. So you can see that on the chart. We get a group of 2-year-olds, let's say, and then we measure something, and then 4 years later we measure it again, maybe, and then maybe another 4 years, and so forth. Okay, now those ages and numbers vary. So as we do this, well, you have one thing that's better about this. You're looking at the same people as time goes on. Now, that said, are the differences we're seeing age-wise now the result of maturation? Maybe. But again, some of these differences that occur, if we observe any, might be due to events or historical changes that occurred as our group went through time. So you say, well, how can we sort out what is the effect of maturation and the passage of time from the influence of events and historical changes? That brings us to cross-sectional research. Okay, so cross-sectional research, we study several groups of people of different ages. So we're taking a cross-sectional approach, and then we follow each of those groups over the years. So we're actually combining the cross-sectional and longitudinal approaches. You see that on the chart here. We might start out with a group of 2-year-olds and then add a new group of 2-year-olds 4 years later, maybe another group of 2-year-olds a few 4 years after that. We continue to collect information on these people over time. And so now notice we can do some analysis that can help us sort out what are the effects of natural maturation, passage of time, as opposed to the effects of various historical events. We can pick out the cohort effects from maturation. And how so? Well, let's say we look at this and we find that this group of 6-year-olds here is different from that group of 6-year-olds. Okay, well, we can conclude that these differences are not due to just natural maturation. They should be the same if that's just nature unfolding. There must be some different experience that's caused this group to be different than the other. This group must have experienced something different than that one to cause them to be different at the same age. So this allows us to sort out cohort effects from the effects of just passage of time. So which is the best one? Well, the reality is cross-sectional research is the very best. What's the downside of cross-sectional research? Well, it takes longer and it's more expensive, more complex. As a matter of fact, many cross-sequential research is begun by one researcher and then someone later on has to take over as time passes, and that first researcher may no longer be able to keep it up. So that's important. The other thing is that, yeah, the more times that's involved, the more people that may drop out and so forth. That makes it more complicated as well. But in general, if we can get some good cross-sequential research, that's going to be the best of all. So last, we come to the topic of ethics. And so what is the ethical things that the researcher must take care of as they conduct their research about human development? Researchers must ensure that participation in research is voluntary, confidential, harmless. Let's talk about voluntary first. Researchers must obtain informed consent if the research involves any sort of intervention that is done, any sort of experimental research and so forth. Um, so that means that the person that is potentially could be in that research is informed about roughly what they're going to experience and given the chance to say, I'll participate or no, I don't care to. They also must be informed that they can drop out of the research at any point in time, no questions asked, no penalties. That prevents people from being coerced, forced to be part of that research or stay in it should they become uncomfortable with it. Now, you might ask, well, what about studying children as we do in human development? Um, there we've got a problem. Children cannot give informed consent. So what do we do there if we want to study children? We have to obtain consent from their parents. Secondly, um, participation in research confidential. So any data that we collect about that person, any information must be safeguarded so it can't be connected with the person that it belongs to. And then research must be harmless. So researchers must submit their proposals for research to an institutional review board that looks at what they intend to do to see, could this potentially be harmful to the participants? So the research is not approved unless that research is not likely to produce harm. You say, well, what do you mean by harm? Well, the guidelines indicate that the person must not be subjected to anything that would be any more harmful than the typical day. So can the researcher maybe make people a little bit anxious in that research? Yeah. Can they traumatize that person by saying your mother just was run over by a train or something? No, it has to be something that is not going to produce harm. So those are some of the basics when it comes to ethics. Okay, so we'll stop it for there. That's a lot of information. And so have a great day, and we'll talk to you next time.